Today we're going to look at modulating within a Bach chorale. This is a really important skill to learn because Bach uses modulations throughout to move between different keys, and Bach uses different ways in which he does it. The first way we're going to look at is a pivot chord modulation. The second way in which Bach modulates is using what's called a phrase modulation. And the third way in which Bach modulates is using an abrupt modulation. Now Bach uses all three types of modulation within his chorale, so it's important that you understand how to use all three so you can put them in your chorale and show them. So pivot chord modulation, that's achieved by using a pivot chord, and a pivot chord is a chord that both keys have in common. Phrase modulation is where a new phrase just launches straight into the new key, and that lasts for the entire phrase. And abrupt modulation is when a chord of the destination's dominant group, so that's chord 5, 5, 7, or 7, diminished 7, appears with no intervening pivot chord. So it's that 5, 7, 5, 7, 5, or 7, 7 to one movement creates sort of a passing modulation. Now pivot chords are really important to understand how they're used because they allow certain things to happen within your chorale. It allows a smooth change of key, and you need to make sure that your pivot chord belongs to both the key you're coming from and modulating to. A pivot chord is also normally followed by a chord of the dominant group. And as I said before, that's chord 5, 5, 7, or 7, diminished 7. So we need to work out how we can actually modulate and what we can do, how we can spot a modulation. Well, the easiest way to spot a modulation is if you've got a note that's clearly outside of the key centre that you're currently in, and it's in a different key which is related to our original key. How do we work out which keys are related? Well, let's take, for example, G major as our tonal centre. Now the relative minor of G major is E minor. The dominant, if I go up 5 notes from G major, I get to D major. And the subdominant, if I go down 5 notes from G major, is C major. And I can have the relative minors of each of these as well. So these are the keys that Bach will modulate to if he was starting in G major. He'd always go to the dominant, subdominant, or the relative minors of any of these. Now it's important on this diagram as well to think carefully about what you modulate to. If I tried to modulate from A minor to D major, that's a long way across our related keys, so it's unlikely to happen. You'd probably want to modulate through your keys to get to D major rather than just going straight all the way across. Sometimes there are key changes from sort of G major to B minor, or diagonally, but not all the way across our diagram. To modulate successfully, there's various steps we need to take. The first one is what key, as we've already described, what key is the phrase modulating to and from? So look for those accidentals. It's always good to identify your cadential formula as well, so you can fill that in at the end of your phrase. Then it's trying to find our pivot chord. Then complete the cadence, and then fill in your remaining chords. And then finally, check your work. So here we have an example of Bach taken from Riemenschneider number 29, if you want to have a look at it. The first thing we're going to do is have a look at where we've come from and where we're going to. I want us to look at the key signature. It's either indicating G major or E minor. Now if we're in E minor, we'd expect to see D sharps, our raised 7th, and here and all the way through the first bar we don't have any D sharps, so it's indicating to me we're going to be in G major. As we go further through, I can see we've got a C sharp here, and it's continued of course later on, which would indicate to me we are in D major. We're adding the C sharp there. So if I go back to my diagram above, G major, I can see it's quite an easy and local shift. Now we've also got here, I'm going to identify my cadential formulae next. So we've got a 3, 2, 1 cadential formula here, and if I work out the chords that we're using, so we've got D, F sharp, A and D, it's chord 1 in root position, A, C sharp, E, chord 5, we've got D, F sharp, and G. So this is chord 1B. So 1B, 5 to 1. If I keep going through my chorale now, so I use a different colour to indicate the different chords. So we start in G at the beginning, G, B, D, G, chord 1, F sharp, A, D, A, that's chord 5B, G, B, D, that's chord 1. Interesting, it's suspended here, so D, A, D, F sharp, chord 5. So here's where we've modulated, so I need to be thinking in D, E, G, D and C sharp and G, so I'm going to have to rearrange these notes, and the way I can make them work so they fit in sort of play one skip one is C sharp, E, G, G, and this D is being sort of suspended across, so in D that would be chord 7. Now if I go back to these ones here, and I think about, if I go back to my rules, a pivot chord belongs to both keys. It's normally followed by a chord of the dominant group. Well, here is a chord of my dominant group, my 7th chord. And this has got to be where we modulate, because by this point we've already modulated into our new key, as indicated by the C sharp. So this chord has got to be the one where we've modulated to. So let's see if this chord works in a different key. So it's 5 in G, but it's 1 in D major. And the reason for that is, if I was to write out my scale of G major, and then write out my scale of D major, I don't know why I've given that one a stem and none of the others. Now if I number them, can see that 1 in D is 5 in G. So Bach there has used a pivot chord to modulate from G major to D major. Okay, so I've switched to Sibelius just to make things a little bit easier to see. So first thing is to identify the key. I've got 1 sharp, so that's G major or E minor. There's no D sharps, so it's going to be G major to begin with. So let me write that in at the top so I know what key I'm in to begin with. And I finish, we've got a C sharp here, so it adds a sharp, so 2 sharps at F and C, meaning we go to D major or B minor. There's no A sharps here, so I'm going to assume we're in D major, particularly as well as that it helps with our cadential formula, which is our second step. Our cadential formula we've got an 8, 7, 8. Let me write that in as well. There we go. So next thing we have to do is work out our pivot chord, and the pivot chord is the chord before our accidentals appear. So they appear in this chord here. So here is going to be our pivot chord. Now we also know that after a pivot chord it's normally followed by a chord of the dominant group, so 5, 5, 7 or 7, 7. So this chord here is going to need to be 5 or 5, 7 or 7, 7. First thing then, or next thing we're going to do now is fill in my cadence. So I'll do this off camera and so I can fill it in. So there's my cadence down. I've got 2, 7B, 5, 2, 1 in D major. Next thing I'm going to do is to work out my pivot chord. So on the screen now you can see my pivot chords I've got. So chord 1 in G is equal to chord 4 in D. Chord 3 in G is equal to 6 in D. Chord 5 in G is equal to 1 in D. And chord 6 in G is equal to 2 in D. So that allows me to choose a chord here. Now I know this is going to be my pivot chord, it's got an A in it, so out of these I need to look at which chords have an A in them. And the best one I'm going to use, I think I'm going to use 5 in G, which is equal to 1 in D. So I'm going to write that in, chord 5 in G. Now for the time being I don't know, I'm going to have to perhaps change these notes around, but I'm just putting them in so I've got them in a place. Let me put, this is chord 5, which is equal to 1. So normally after a pivot chord we get, it's followed as I said earlier by a chord of the dominant group. So that would be 5 of D, which would be A. So I'm going to use the B as a passing note and harmonise on the C sharp. So that's chord 5. And I'm going to put chord 1 here as well. So it just leaves me 2 more chords now to fill in. I need to be thinking in G major for these first 2 chords. I'm going to start on chord 1. Another thing, I'm going to go to 1B. So there we have it. We have our completed chorale phrase using a pivot chord going to our dominant chord to modulate from G major to D major. Let's have a listen and see how it sounds. So there we have it, we have our completed chorale. Let's have a listen. So here you can see I've marked on my cadential formulae at the top, I've marked on my pivot chord, I've made sure I've sharpened the leading note of D major as well to allow me to complete this chorale. Now it's using a lot of 1 and 5 at the minute, but let's have a listen. So there's one version. Here's another option that you could use. You could use chord 7 diminished 7 just to create a slightly different sound. Have a listen. I personally prefer the sound of this one. I think it just gives a bit more colour to the overall harmony. So I'm going to stick with that, but what I need to do now is make sure that I haven't got any mistakes. So point 5 is always check your work carefully. And there you have it. So as you saw through the time lapse, I just sped things up there, and this is what I've ended up with. I've changed a couple of the inversions. I've tried to keep some movement throughout as well as making sure the voicing is quite nice all the way through as well. Let's have a listen then and just hear how the final chorale came out. So there you have it. I hope you found this useful. Come out next time and we'll have a look at phrase and abrupt modulations. Thanks very much.